So welcome to Excel 101. What we're going to discuss here is a brief overview of some of the key concepts of Microsoft Excel. We'll look at how the user interface looks, what the different parts of the user interface are, as well as some key functions and formulas and modules that are used by a lot of analysts. Let's start with an overview of Excel's user interface, which is what you see as a user each time you open a workbook or an Excel file. So this here is the user interface. By default, every Excel workbook or Excel file has three sheets to start with, named Sheet 1, Sheet 2 and Sheet 3. A blank Excel file will always begin at Sheet 1. Additional sheets can always be added here by clicking on the plus symbol. So any user can click on this symbol to add sheets, like we're doing right here. Let's quickly clean these up. Now each sheet is made up of rows and columns. Now columns run vertically and are identified by letters of the English alphabet. So here we can see I've selected column D, column E and column F. Sometimes columns can also be identified by combinations of two letters of the English alphabet. Let's scroll to the right. So once we run out of the first 26 letters, we have column AA, AB and AC, etc. This is what I mean when I say some columns are identified by combinations of two letters of the English alphabet. This line at the very top is called the column header. It tells us the letter of the column that we're currently at. Rows, on the other hand, run horizontally and are identified by numbers. This column here contains the row header and it tells us the row number we're at. So if I click on this cell, we can see this row header being highlighted. If I click here, we can see 17 being highlighted, and so on. Columns and rows intersect each other at cells. For example, this is a cell, this is a cell. Every single box you see on the sheet is a cell because it is an intersection of a specific row with a specific column. Now, understanding how cells work and interact with each other is fundamental to understanding and mastering Microsoft Excel. The column letter and row number of a particular cell in combination create what's called a cell reference, which is essentially the default name for each cell. Each cell in the worksheet, or in this worksheet for example, can be identified by this combination of letters and numbers. For example, this cell I've selected is made up of an intersection of column H and row 8, which means the cell reference for this cell is H8, as can be seen here in this name box. Let's try a different cell. You can see this is A1. Let's go down column G and click here. This is G14, as can be seen in the name box. Notice here that every time I click on a cell, there's a little box that appears on that cell. This leads us to a concept which is known as active cell. The active cell is basically the cell which has currently been selected by a user, like maybe this one or this one or this one. Any cell I select is going to become the new active cell. It can be recognized by a border that surrounds it. The active cell can always be changed by either using the mouse to click on other cells or by using the arrow keys on your keyboard to move between cells. Data is always entered into the active cell. Let's look at this place right here. This is what's known as the formula bar. The formula bar always displays the contents of the active cell, but it can also be used to add or edit the contents of a given cell. So for example, if I click on this cell, we see the formula bar is blank. But what about if I click here? It shows me the value of 0, which it takes from the active cell. If I click here, it shows run scored. So every time I change the active cell, the formula bar shows me what's in that particular cell. Sometimes a cell might not contain values and might contain formulas, which may include references to other cells. In that case, the formula bar will show me that particular reference. We'll see it in a little bit when we look at formulas and functions. The name box on the top left here displays the cell reference or the name of the active cell. So sometimes I can replace this cell reference E14 and give a cell a specific name. If I do so, that name will then be reflected in this name box when I select that particular cell. This section right here is known as Excel's ribbon. The ribbon is a strip of buttons located above the worksheet. It's organized into a series of tabs such as File, Home, Insert, Page Layout, Data, etc. Each of these tabs, of course, contain multiple modules and formulas and other options within them, which is what makes Excel so complicated, but which is also what makes Excel so beautiful and powerful to use. This little area right here is known as the Quick Access toolbar. The Quick Access toolbar allows you to add and save shortcuts to frequently used options and features. So let's say there's an Excel process or procedure that I find myself using very frequently, maybe every 15 minutes. I can save it in the Quick Access toolbar, so that I can refer to it very quickly. If I click on this arrow right here, it gives me some options to add quickly to the Quick Access toolbar. I can also go in and add more commands and save them. For example, let's say I'm using the Format Painter a lot. So I can add it to the Quick Access toolbar and say OK. Now you see this appears here. So now each time I want to use this painter, I don't have to go and find it. Now of course it's right here, but let's say I was on some other tab. I don't have to switch tabs. I can quickly use it here, or I can find a shortcut to add it each time I want to use it. One last thing about the user interface can be found at the very top. The name of the current workbook is always displayed at the center and very top of the Excel window. So we can always find it here. This sheet I'm currently using, or this workbook I'm currently using, is called Excel 01. Entering data or formulas in a cell is a very simple and straightforward process. Simply click on a cell like so it becomes the active cell, a concept that we just discussed. Then begin typing. So let's say I want to enter some values here. So I just enter them, and that's about it. A user can either enter values directly or enter a formula into a cell, which may or may not include references to other cells in the formula. Let me show you a quick way to do this, and then we'll look at it later, of course. So let's say here I've entered 70, 10 and 100, and now I want to enter a cell reference. So I'm going to say is equal to this cell, and I say enter, which means it copies the value that's in this cell. So as you can see here in the formula bar, when I select H8, it shows me a value of 100. When I select H9, it says is equal to H8, because that's the formula I've used. Now the advantage of using this is it becomes dynamic. If I change this value now to 88, the value in H9 correspondingly changes, because it's always going to pick up the value that's in H8. Now entries can also be made directly into the formula bar right here. Anything entered here will be entered directly into the active cell. So let's look at a quick example. So if I go here, I can go here and say 70 in the formula bar. I can select this cell G2, go here and say is equal to H11. That's the formula in G2. Once a particular value is entered into a cell, pressing the enter key will enter the data and then move the active cell highlight down to the cell below it. So if I'm in this cell, if I just press enter, it keeps moving one cell down. The tab key will enter the data and then move to the cell to the right of the current cell. So if I press tab, you see this active cell moving right. I just moved it back. Users can also navigate using the arrow keys as discussed earlier. The escape key on your keyboard cancels any data that's currently being entered in a cell. So let's say I'm halfway through entering some number and I realize it's wrong. If I just press the escape key, it cancels that particular entry. Data that's entered in a cell or in a combination of multiple cells can be copied and pasted across different cells in the same sheet, across multiple sheets, in the same workbook, or even across different Excel files altogether. So let's say I want to take this and I say copy this cell, and I can go here and maybe paste it. I can also copy a combination of cells or multiple cells. As you can see, this little dashed line that's moving tells me which range of cells I've selected. A group of cells is always called a range. And now this is my destination and I can paste it. As you can see, it now pasted the entire range that I had copied here. Excel accepts multiple formats for the data, including numbers, text, currency or dates and times, percentages and fractions, and a host of other custom data formats. All the data I've entered here are in numbers, but I could just as well have entered some text. Let me enter some text here. Range, made a quick typo, active cell, formula, etc. So as you can see, I have some data here in numbers and some that are in text. The entire range of data types can be found under this drop down menu. Let's now look at some formulas, but first I'm going to clean up all of these cells. So I select all of them, right click and say clear contents. So now our data set and our sheet looks clean. As we've discussed earlier, each cell is identified by a unique combination of the column letter and the row number. This is known as a cell reference. Cell references are commonly used to refer to or to pull data from another cell and use it in a formula or in a different cell altogether. Formulas and functions are perhaps among the most useful concepts in Excel. A formula always begins with an equal to sign, as we saw in an earlier example. Following this, a user can enter a combination of numbers, text and functions, all linked together using arithmetic operations. Functions are like predefined formulas in Excel, used to carry out operations on the data contained either in that particular cell or in a combination of cells. Let's now look at some very commonly used functions and formulas in Excel. Let's first look at some mathematical functions. Excel has a lot of built-in functions to perform a variety of mathematical operations, ranging from the most simple ones to the very complex. Everything from addition to subtraction to division, all the way up to regression models and even more. Excel can even solve optimization problems for you using an add-in known as the solver. Let's look at some simple examples. So let's run some mathematical operations on column E. So let's say I wanted to add a few of these numbers. So by the way, this is a data set which represents all of Sachin Tendulkar's scores across his one-day international cricketing career. So let's run some mathematical operations on column E, which tells us the number of runs he scored in every match. So now let's say I wanted to add a few of these numbers. So I can do this in two ways. I can either say I want to add E7 and E8, but notice I'm storing it in cell F7, right? So this now gives me the sum of 19 and 31, which is 50. I can of course add more cells, right? So I can now say add this cell and this cell and maybe this one and maybe this one. Excel very quickly gives me the sum of all those cells. Now notice that in function I am manually using the plus symbol to add individual cells. Now this is okay if we are adding a few cells or running other operations on a few cells, but what if we want to use a large range of cells and run an addition operation on all of them? What we can then do is use Excel's built-in function to compute the sum. So I'm going to say I want the sum of all these cells. So as you can see the formula here, it says is equal to, which is how we begin every formula, sum of E2 to E28. E2 to E28 represents the range. So it starts at E2 and goes all the way down to E28. It's a very arbitrary range of cells that I selected for this example, but you get the picture. If you're ever confused about how to use a formula, Excel always has great help functionality, as can be found here in this question mark, but it also has some very quick help that you could use. So if I say is equal to sum, Excel automatically shows me a quick description of what that formula does, adds all the numbers in a range of cells. If I then open the parentheses, it prompts me for specific inputs. So it says number 1, number 2, etc. At this stage I can select the cell, which as you can see is dynamically getting input into the formula, and then I close the braces and say enter, and it gives me the sum. There are other similar mathematical operations that we can use. So I can say I want to divide this cell by this cell, and then of course I have the flexibility to add as many decimal points as I'd like. So I can decrease it or increase it depending on what I like to do. I can also multiply numbers. So I can say I want this number multiplied by this number. Now I don't understand why anyone would want to multiply two runs scored options, but just in case. As you can see here, I'm using direct numbers in some cases, but I'm also using cell references, which makes my life easier, because in the case of larger, much more complicated data sets, it's always easier to use a formula such as this one or this one to compute the total runs scored. Here's another quick trick. If I want to add all the runs scored, all the entries in column E, all I have to do is say sum and just click on the column header, which means any run scored entry entered in column E will now be entered in this formula. So it looks like Sachin Tendulkar has scored 17,742 runs in all the matches listed here. Another formula or another function that's similar to sum is of course average. So as you can see here, there's a quick description. It says return the average or the arithmetic mean of its arguments, which can be numbers or names, arrays or references that contain numbers. It's a nice description of what this function is about to do. So what if I want to know the average of all the runs he scored? Let's select column E. It's 41.16. I can also find the median, which is another useful function of the same range. Let's quickly clean this up. So I'm going to click on column F on the header and say delete. Now Excel also has a lot of text functions. The list of functions we just looked at are all mathematical functions because they all work on numbers. But Excel also has a host of functions that can be used across dates and across text entries. So let's say I want to take this list right here and copy it, and I'm going to paste it here. And let's play around with this little small data set right here. Right, so I'm going to show you some quick functions that I can find in Excel that can deal with text entries. So let's say I want to know the length of each entry here, the length of the words in each entry in column G. Excel has a function called len, which returns the number of characters in a text string. All I have to do is then input the text. It says Gujranwala, which is a stadium in Pakistan. The word Gujranwala is made up of 10 characters. Now here's another trick. I can either then take this formula and copy it and apply it here, in which case it will apply the same formula to this entry in column G3. What I could now do is take this formula and click on this little box here. You see this little green box in the corner, and drag it all the way down. And what I'm essentially telling Excel to do is apply the same formula here in each of these cells. Notice that as I go down, the argument in this formula changes. So here it's calculating the length of G3, here it's calculating the length of G4, here is calculating the length of G5, etc. Now the cell reference keeps moving as the formula gets dragged further and further down, simply because it's adapting the formula to that particular cell. There is a way to prevent this from happening though. Right, so let's quickly look at how we can do that. So I'm going to right click here and clear the contents. So let's say once again I want to compute the length of the entry here. If I drag this down, length of G2 will then become length of G3 for the formula in cell H3. But what if I'd like to prevent that from happening? So let's delete this. Now if I use a dollar symbol here in the cell reference, essentially what this tells Excel to do is to make sure that this cell reference stays constant, which means if I now drag this down, it's still going to say 10 because G2 remains a constant wherever I drag this function. So if I drag this all the way down, I expect all the entries to be 10, which is what it is. Let's quickly clear this up. Let's look at a couple of other text functions before we proceed. Let's look at a function called left. What left does is returns the specified number of characters from the start of a text string. So if I include left and open the brackets, it takes in two arguments, the text under consideration and the number of characters. So let's say I want to perform an operation here and I use the number 5. What this is doing is telling Excel to take the text that's in cell G2 and start from the left extreme and only pull out the first 5 characters. And that's what I'd like to see returned in H2. Now what if I change this to 6? You see it changed from Gujarat to Gujran. What if I changed it to say 7 or maybe 8? Now if I took this formula again and dragged it all the way down, let's see it goes. One thing you can see here is in the case of leads, the total number of characters is less than 8, which is why it returned the entire string. Similarly, there's another function called right. which mirrors this function. It does the exact same functionality that we can get from the left function, but it begins from the right extreme. So I can say right of this text and 5. Let me drag this down, and you can see it's mirroring what this does. So let's quickly clean this up once again.